The noose was already looped over the crossbeam of the livery barn when Olive Easton shouldered through the crowd with a fistful of yellow telegraph paper and screamed for them to stop. "You will not hang this man on the word of a lie sent down a wire," she shouted, and her voice cracked across the torchlit yard louder than she believed it could. Men who had been muttering and passing a jug fell silent. Someone's horse shied at the sudden quiet. Up on the wagon bed that served as a gallows platform, Samuel Granger stood with his wrists bound and his hat gone. His jaw set the way a man's jaw sets when he has already made peace with dying and does not intend to beg for anything else. He looked at her first, not at the rope, not at Judge Wendell Colton, who stood below the wagon in his good black coat with his silver-headed cane, directing the whole affair like a man conducting a hymn. Samuel looked at Olive, and something in his face loosened just slightly, the way a held breath loosens when a door opens somewhere far off. "Miss Easton," Judge Colton said, and his voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who had spent 30 years being obeyed. "This is a matter for the town's justice, not for the telegraph office. Go home. This is a matter for the truth, Judge, and the truth came across my key 2 hours ago." Olive climbed onto the wagon step so the crowd could see the paper she held, and she did not let her hand shake, though inside she was shaking everywhere else. "This telegram is a forgery. It claims to be signed by a man named Silas Hooper, wiring from the Western Union office in Tucson, swearing he saw Samuel Granger murder Tobias Reyes. But I have worked that key for 6 years, and I know Tucson's hand as well as I know my own name. This was not sent from Tucson. It came in on the short spur line from the Colton Ranch, not the trunk line from the south, and it was sent by a man who sends his dashes long and drags his letters together the way a man does when he learned his code from a rancher's manual instead of a proper school. I have heard that hand before. It belongs to Jed Calloway, who works Gideon Colton's herd." A murmur went through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Somebody near the back said, "Lo, that true, Otis?" And Sheriff Otis Prout, standing near the wagon with his own rifle held loose and uncertain, did not answer. Judge Colton's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes went very still. "A telegraph girl's fancy about handwriting is not evidence, Olive. It is gossip dressed up in wire and ink." It was Samuel who spoke then, and his voice, though rough from 2 days in a cell without much water, carried the flat certainty of a man who had once worn a badge and known exactly how such things worked. "It is evidence, Judge, and you know it is. I spent 4 years as marshal of this town before I turned in my star, and in that time I sent and received near every telegram that ever mattered to the law in this valley. An operator can tell one sender's hand from another the way a blacksmith can tell one man's hammer strikes from the next. Ask any agent on the Southern Pacific Line. Ask the superintendent in Tucson himself if you doubt her. But do not stand there and tell this crowd that a lie wired in from 3 miles up your own son's spur line is a sworn statement from 100 miles south." He drew a breath. "You are fixing to hang me on a piece of paper you know is false, because it is easier than finding who is true." The crowd's mood, which had been ugly and eager only minutes before, had begun to curdle into something uncertain. A rancher named Otto Fenn, who had known Samuel since the martial days, pushed forward and took the telegram from Olive's hand and held it up to the torchlight, squinting at the routing marks printed faint along the top edge. "Says here Douglas Relay, then Colton Spur," Fenn read slowly. "Don't say Tucson trunk nowhere on it. I ain't no operator, but even I can read a routing stamp." He looked up at Judge Colton with an expression that had not existed on his face a moment before, something between confusion and dawning suspicion. "Judge, this don't look right." "Cut him down," someone else called, and though it was not everyone, it was enough. A ragged handful of voices rising until the momentum in the yard shifted like a wagon tipping off its axle. Sheriff Prout, sensing which way the wind now blew and being a man who had always been more careful of his own hide than of justice, stepped up onto the wagon and began working at the rope himself, mumbling something about how it was only proper to wait for the circuit judge anyhow. Judge Colton's face had gone the color of old ash, but he recovered himself with the smoothness of long practice. He raised his cane and struck the wagon wheel once, sharply, and the crowd quieted out of pure habit. "Very well," he said. "If there is doubt, then there is doubt, and this county has a proper court to settle it, not a rope and a bonfire. Sheriff Prout will hold Mr. Granger in the jailhouse until Judge Ashford arrives on his circuit 3 weeks hence, and the matter will be tried as the law requires." His eyes found Olive's, and there was nothing warm left in them at all. "And Miss Easton will, I am sure, be available to explain her theories to the court, under oath, where such things may be properly examined." It was not mercy. Olive understood that even as relief crashed through her so hard her knees nearly buckled. It was a tactical retreat, a man choosing to lose a skirmish so that he might still win the war on ground of his own choosing. But it bought 3 weeks, and 3 weeks was more than the rope had offered a moment before. They cut Samuel down from the wagon rather than from the crossbeam, his wrists still bound, and as Prout led him past her toward the jailhouse, he stopped, just for a moment, close enough that she could see the rope burn already rising red at his throat where the noose had been set but never drawn. "Thank you," he said. Just that. His eyes, gray as river stone, held hers with an intensity that had nothing to do with gratitude alone. "I only read what came across my key," she said, because she did not know what else to say, because her heart was hammering in a way that had nothing to do with fear anymore. "You read it right," Samuel said, "and you had the courage to say so in front of a crowd fixing to hang me. That is not nothing, Miss Easton. That is not nothing at all." Then Prout tugged his arm and led him on toward the little stone jailhouse at the end of the street, and Olive stood in the emptying yard with the forged telegram still crumpled in her fist, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the mob had, that she was not going to be able to walk away from this man's fate even if she wanted to. The Paloma Crossing jailhouse had 2 cells, a stove that smoked more than it warmed, and a single barred window that looked out on the dusty width of the town's main street, and beyond it, the first gold-andrust slopes of the Chiricahuas rising into a sky so blue and clean it seemed to promise nothing could ever go wrong beneath it. Olive had grown up watching that sky lie in exactly that fashion every October of her life. Her mother used to say the mountains dressed themselves prettiest right before the weather turned mean, as if trying to apologize in advance. She came to the jail 2 mornings after the near hanging, carrying a basket with bread and a jar of her own put-up peaches, and found Sheriff Prout dozing in his chair with his hat over his eyes, which suited her purposes well enough. "You should not be here," Samuel said, but he came to the bars anyway, and there was no real conviction in the warning. "I run the only telegraph office within 30 miles, Mr. Granger, and half the county already thinks I have opinions above my station. I do not believe a basket of peaches is going to make that reputation any worse." She passed the jar through the bars. "Besides, I have questions, and you are the only man in this town who has ever worn a badge and can tell me if what I am thinking is foolishness or not." He studied her for a moment, and she had the distinct sense of being weighed, though not unkindly. "Ask then. Tobias Reyes was killed on the strip of land along the North Ford, the land your bridge is meant to cross. Judge Colton has wanted that crossing for the toll he charges on his own bridge downstream for 11 years, ever since I can remember. Tobias would not sell his water rights to the Colton Bank, and everyone in this town knew it, and everyone in this town also knew you had resigned your star rather than ride out and evict the Reyes family on a debt Judge Colton's own bank had cooked up out of thin air." She watched his face carefully as she said it, and saw nothing there but a grim, tired confirmation. "So it seems to me a strange coincidence that Tobias winds up dead within a month of that eviction order, and the man they choose to hang for it is the one man in the county who refused to do Colton's dirty work in the first place." "It is not a coincidence," Samuel said quietly. "It is a convenience." I made myself an easy target the day I turned in my star and told Wendell Colton to his face that I would not run a family off land they had paper for, just because his bank wanted the water under it. Gideon has hated me since before that. He hates any man who will not bend when his father tells him to bend, and he hates it worse in a man who used to carry the authority to make him answer for his temper. He gripped the bars, and for the first time she saw something other than iron control cross his face, something like grief. Tobias was a decent man. He had a wife carrying their first child and a herd of 30 head and a stretch of river frontage that Colton coveted for 11 years, same as you say. I do not know for certain that Gideon killed him, but I would wager my life on it, which is, I suppose, exactly what I am doing. Maria, Olive said softly. His wife. She is due within a month, maybe less, and she is alone out there now, on the far side of the ford, with no one but an old aunt who does not speak much English, and does not trust anyone with an Anglo name to come near her at such a time. She had delivered 3 babies on that side of the river already this year, riding the ford at first light when the water ran low and clear, and she had promised Maria she would come whenever she was called, storm or no storm. It was, she realized only now, saying it aloud, part of why the forged telegram had struck her so hard. Whoever had sent that lie down the wire had been willing to hang an innocent man and leave a pregnant widow twice orphaned of justice in the same stroke, and Olive found that the 2 injustices had lodged themselves together in her chest, inseparable, both demanding to be answered. "You believe me, then," Samuel said. It was not quite a question. "I believed the routing stamp on that telegram before I ever believed anything about you, Mr. Granger," she said, though there was a smile trying at the corner of her mouth despite herself. "But I will admit that in the 2 days since, I have come to believe rather more." He almost smiled back, the rope burn at his throat still an angry line above his collar, and for a moment the smoked little jailhouse with its dozing sheriff and its bars and its smell of ash did not feel like the most dangerous place in the county, but simply like 2 people finding, unexpectedly, that they liked each other's company. 3 weeks, he said. "Judge Ashford is an honest man, from everything I ever knew of him riding the circuit. If your evidence about the wire holds up in a proper court, and if Jed Calloway can be made to tell the truth of what he saw or did not see, I have a chance." "Then we had better make certain both of those things happen," Olive said, "because I do not intend to watch you hang on a Colton lie while I have breath left to argue against it." The storm that would matter most was still 10 days off when the first small one came, the kind that rattled shutters and filled arroyos with brown water for an hour before rolling on east toward New Mexico. But it was enough to remind Olive why the ford mattered so badly, and why Samuel had spent the better part of a year building toward its remedy before a murder charge had interrupted him. She found him at the site the evening after her jailhouse visit, released now on a bond that Otto Finn and a dozen other ranchers had put up between them, mostly out of shame at how close they had come to hanging an innocent man on Colton's say-so. The bridge stood half-finished across the narrows where the river cut deepest, a skeleton of squared timber and iron strap, abandoned mid-span since his arrest, its raw new wood pale against the darker, weathered planks of Colton's toll bridge 2 miles downstream, the one that charged 4 bits a wagon, and had drowned 2 travelers in the 11 years it had stood, both times in flood season when desperate folk tried to ford above it rather than pay the toll they could not afford. "You are supposed to be resting," Olive said, climbing down from her buggy. "Otto Finn did not put up his best mare as bond so you could break your neck falling off a bridge before the trial even starts." "I cannot rest," Samuel said, without turning from the beam he was measuring. "Every day this stands half-finished is a day some family risks that ford instead, and every day it stands half-finished is a day Colton can point at it and say, 'See, the man could not even finish what he started. Why trust anything else he claims?'" He set down his rule and looked at her, and in the long copper light of the sinking sun, he looked younger than he had in the jailhouse, less a man on trial for his life and more simply a man doing work he loved. Besides, it gives me something to do with my hands besides think about rope. She should have gone home. It was near dark, and she had the evening telegraph traffic to see to, and a woman alone on a half-built bridge with a man out on bond for murder, however innocent she believed him, was not the sort of thing that would help either of their reputations in a town already primed to gossip. But she picked her way out onto the span instead, testing each timber before she trusted her weight to it, until she stood beside him looking down at the river running dark and swift below. "My father built the telegraph office with his own hands," she said, unprompted, because something about the smell of raw-cut pine and river water loosened her tongue the way it seemed to loosen his. "He was a Western Union man from Ohio who came out on the stage line before the railroad ever reached this valley, and my mother was a partera, a midwife, from a ranching family near Fronteras, south of the line. They built something here that neither one of them could have built alone. He taught me the key. She taught me to catch babies and set bones and know when a fever was going to break and when it was going to take somebody with it." She looked out at the mountains, gold and red now in the last light, hiding, as they always did this time of year, whatever weather was truly coming. "I suppose I have always thought that was the whole of what a person could offer a place like this. Two skills, stitched together, standing where two kinds of people needed a bridge between them anyway. That is not a small thing to offer," Samuel said quietly. "I spent 4 years wearing a badge in this town, and I never managed to be a bridge for anybody. I mostly just tried not to be a wall." He hesitated, and then added with a wry twist to his mouth that she was coming to look forward to seeing, "Though I suppose I am attempting an actual bridge now, which may be some kind of overcorrection." She laughed, surprising herself with how easily it came, given everything. "It is a fine bridge, Mr. Granger, when it is finished." "Samuel," he said, "you saved my life 2 nights ago with a scrap of yellow paper and more nerve than half the men in that crowd combined. I believe you have earned the right to my first name." "Olive then," she said, and held out her hand, and he took it, his palm rough with rope and timber work, and they stood there on the unfinished bridge in the last of the light, a moment longer than either of them strictly needed to. Before the cold coming down off, the mountains reminded them both that the day was ending and there was still work left undone. The second small storm, 4 days later, was the one that mattered. Olive had stayed late at the telegraph office finishing a backlog of freight manifests when the wind came up sudden and hard out of the northwest, rattling the shutters and guttering the lamp until she had to cup her hand around the flame to keep it lit. She was reaching to bar the door against the worst of it when she heard boots on the boardwalk outside, more than one set, moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with weather. She had just enough warning to blow out the lamp and duck below the counter before the door was tried, found locked, and then struck hard enough to crack the frame. A voice she recognized, low and mean, belonging to one of Gideon Colton's hired hands, a man named Purdy who wore his gun low and his grievances lower, called through the gap. "Open up, girl. Mr. Gideon wants a word about wires you got no business reading." She did not open up. Instead she crawled to the key, working by feel in the dark, and sent, as fast and clean as her trembling hands would allow, a call for help along the line toward the only 2 people in town she trusted to come running. The sheriff's office, for whatever little good that would do given Prute's loyalties, and on impulse the private line Samuel had strung from the bridge site to the office months before he lost his badge, back when he still thought he might need to wire for supplies in a hurry. The door gave on the 3rd strike, splintering inward, and Purdy came through with a lantern and another man behind him, and Olive backed against the wall with the only weapon she had at hand, a heavy brass paperweight shaped like an eagle that had sat on her father's desk for 20 years, and did not scream, because screaming would only tell them exactly where she stood in the dark. "Judge don't like being made a fool of in front of half the county," Purdy said, advancing with the lantern held high. You're going to write out a nice statement for us saying you misread that telegram, and then we're all going to forget this ever." The door behind him burst open a second time, and Samuel came through it soaked to the knees from crossing the wash at a dead run, with a shotgun that Otto Fenn had lent him for exactly this kind of situation, and the barrel found Purdy's chest before the man had even finished turning. "Take one more step toward her," Samuel said, and his voice had gone flat and cold in a way Olive had not heard from him before, a lawman's voice, the voice of a man who had once been paid to be dangerous and had never entirely lost the knack. "And I will finish what your boss's rope did not manage 2 weeks ago." Purdy's companion, a younger man with less stomach for the work than his wages required, was already backing toward the broken door. Purdy himself weighed the shotgun and the look on Samuel's face, and decided, visibly, that his employer's grudge was not worth dying over tonight. "This ain't finished," he muttered, but he was moving backward as he said it, hands raised just enough to be safe, and in another moment both men were gone into the wind and the dark, and Samuel lowered the shotgun and turned to find Olive still pressed against the wall, the brass eagle still clutched in her fist, shaking now that the danger had passed rather than during it. "You are hurt," he said, crossing to her. "No, only frightened, which I believe is the more sensible reaction, now that it is safe to have it." She let the paperweight fall from her fingers and it struck the floor with a dull thud, and then, without entirely deciding to, she was in his arms, her face against the wet wool of his coat, and he was holding her the way a man holds something he has just realized he cannot bear to lose. "I heard your call on the line before I heard the door go," he said into her hair. "I do not think I have run that fast since I was a boy. You forded the wash in this weather, in the dark." She pulled back enough to look at him, appalled and grateful in equal measure. "I was not going to let anyone hurt you over a telegram you had every right to send." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb lingering a moment against her cheek. "Olive, I have been trying to tell myself for a week now that what I feel is only gratitude. A man does not easily forget the woman who talks a mob out of hanging him. But it has become considerably more than gratitude, and I think it has been more than that since the moment you climbed onto that wagon with your chin up and your hands shaking, and told the whole county they were about to kill an innocent man. It is more than gratitude for me as well," she admitted, and her voice was not entirely steady. "I have delivered 40 babies in this valley and mended more broken bones than I can count and sent 10,000 wires up and down this line, and I do not believe I have ever once, in all that time, felt the way I have felt these 2 weeks with you." Outside, the wind had begun to ease, though the sky, when Samuel finally coaxed the shutters closed against it, was a strange, bruised color that neither of them liked the look of, gold and violet fading into a hard, flat gray at the western edge of the mountains. The kind of sky that made old-timers in the valley talk about battening down early, even when the almanac promised nothing worse than a light frost. "That does not look like weather passing through," Samuel said, frowning at the gap between the shutters before he latched them. "That looks like weather building." "It is only October," Olive said, though she did not entirely believe her own reassurance. "We have 3 more weeks of good bridge weather yet, surely." They spent the remainder of that night in the Telegraph office rather than risk the wash again in the dark. Samuel on a bedroll made of horse blankets by the cold stove, Olive in her own narrow cot behind the counter, the broken door propped shut with a chair and a length of chain. And though nothing passed between them but quiet talk until the small hours, about her mother's remedies and his years as a boy in Texas, and the bridge and the trial and everything they still had left to fear. Olive would remember it afterward as the night she stopped merely believing in Samuel Granger's innocence and started, instead, to believe in a future with him in it. The bridge went up faster after that night than it had any right to, because half the ranchers who had put up Samuel's bond began showing up at the site with their own tools and their own sons, partly out of guilt for how close they had come to hanging him, and partly, Olive suspected, because Otto Fenn had gone around telling anyone who would listen that a man who could keep his head clear enough to disarm 2 of Colton's hired guns without firing a shot was exactly the sort of man this county needed more of, not fewer. Olive came out most afternoons after her telegraph traffic slowed, first to bring coffee and cornbread, and then, when it became clear she had a good eye for measurement and steadier hands than half the men twice her size, to actually work the ropes and pulleys herself, hauling timber into place while Samuel called instructions from the far bank. It was, she thought, watching him strip to his shirt sleeves in the autumn sun, driving iron spikes with a strength and rhythm that made something low in her stomach go warm and unsteady, entirely unlike anything her mother had ever warned her a proper courtship ought to look like, and entirely, wonderfully, better. "You are staring, Miss Easton," Samuel called across the span, not looking up from his work, a grin audible in his voice even at that distance. "I am admiring the joinery," she called back, and heard Otto Fenn's booming laugh from further down the bank, and did not bother pretending she had meant anything else, because by then half the crew had guessed the truth of things between her and Samuel anyway, and no one seemed inclined to disapprove of it, save for those loyal to Colton, and there were fewer of those with each passing day. It was on the 9th day of that work, with the central span nearly complete and only the far approach still needing its planking, that the sabotage came. Olive arrived at dawn to find the ropes that had held the last night's timber stack cut clean through, the logs scattered and half rolled into the river, and scorch marks along one newly laid beam where someone had tried, unsuccessfully, to set it alight before a night rain had put the fire out before it could take proper hold. Samuel crouched at the burned beam, running his thumb along the char, his jaw tight. "Gideon does not want this bridge finished before the trial," he said. "A finished bridge means Colton's toll crossing loses its monopoly on this stretch of river, and that has always mattered to him more than any murder charge or any circuit judge. He would rather burn my work down plank by plank than let this valley have a free crossing. Then we build faster than he can burn," Olive said, and there was iron in her voice now to match his, "and we set a watch on it besides." They did both. Otto Fenn's sons took turns sleeping in a lean-to at the near bank with a shotgun and a lantern, and the work crew doubled its pace, driven now by simple stubborn fury as much as goodwill. And within a week the last plank was laid and the last rail set, and the bridge stood complete across the Narrows, raw and pale and strong, 3 days before Judge Micah Ashford was due to arrive on his circuit to hear the case that would decide whether Samuel Granger lived free or died on Colton's rope after all. It was that same week, with the bridge finished and the trial looming, that Olive's telegraph key delivered the piece of news that very nearly cost them everything they had built toward. She was working the evening traffic when the wire came in from the Southern Pacific station master in the next town over, a routine freight query that happened, almost as an aside, to mention that a passenger had purchased a one-way ticket north under the name J. Calloway, to depart on the Thursday afternoon train, cash paid, no baggage checked but a single locked strongbox carried by hand. Olive sat very still after she finished transcribing the message, staring at the name until its significance settled fully into her chest. Jed Calloway, the man whose sending hand she had recognized on the forged telegram. The one witness who could confirm, under oath, whether he had truly seen Samuel at the scene of Tobias Ray's death, or whether he had simply been paid or frightened into signing a lie that had nearly hanged an innocent man. Thursday was 2 days off. Judge Ashford was not due until Friday. If Jed Calloway left town on that train, the county's best chance at the truth would leave with him, along with, she was quite certain, whatever evidence he carried locked in that strongbox. She found Samuel at the finished bridge, testing the last of the railings, and told him everything in a rush, and watched the color drain from his face as the implications settled over him the same way they had settled over her. If he runs, Ashford will have nothing but your testimony about a forged wire and Colton's word against it," Samuel said. "It may be enough to raise doubt. It may not be enough to save me, not against a family that owns the bank and half the county commission besides." "Then we do not let him run," Olive said. "We go to that platform Thursday and we stop him." "Olive." Samuel caught her hand before she could turn away, and there was real fear in his eyes now, the first she had seen there since the night of the noose, and it was not fear for himself. "If Gideon's men are watching that depot to make sure Calloway leaves clean, this will not be a conversation. It will be a fight in front of half the county, and I cannot ask you to stand in the middle of that." "You are not asking," Olive said. "I am telling you I am coming, the same as I told that mob 2 weeks ago that I would not stand by and watch a lie hang an innocent man. I did not stop believing that the moment the rope came down, Samuel. I do not intend to start now." He studied her for a long moment, and then slowly the fear in his face gave way to something else, something that looked very much like pride. "All right," he said. "Together, then." Thursday came in bright and hard-edged, the kind of high mountain autumn day that made the whole valley look freshly painted, the cottonwoods along the river gone the color of old gold coins, the sky above the Chiricahuas a blue so deep it looked lacquered on, and beneath all of it, so faint that only the old-timers seemed to notice, a smell in the air like distant rain on hot rock that had nothing to do with the day's own weather at all. The depot platform at Paloma Crossing was crowded that afternoon, more crowded than usual because word had gotten around, as word always did in a town that size, that something was going to happen there, though no one could quite say what. Ranchers who had worked the bridge stood near the freight office. A knot of townswomen clustered by the ticket window, pretending to discuss dry goods while watching everything. And near the far end of the platform, close by the baggage car, stood Jed Calloway himself, a thin, sunburned man of perhaps 30 with a strongbox clutched against his chest like it might grow legs and run without him, flanked by 2 of Gideon Colton's men, Purdy among them, and Gideon Colton himself, mounted on a fine black gelding just beyond the platform rail, watching the whole scene with the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. Olive saw him first from the ticket window end of the platform and felt her stomach drop. Samuel, beside her, went very still. "He is not just seeing Calloway off," Samuel said quietly. "He is making certain of it." They moved together down the length of the platform, through the crowd, and Purdy saw them coming when they were still 30 feet off and stepped into their path, one hand resting meaningfully near his gun. "Train ain't for another 20 minutes, Purdy said. "Nothing here concerns you." "Jed Calloway concerns me a great deal," Samuel said, not slowing, "seeing as his signed statement is what nearly got me hanged, and his testimony is what might yet clear my name 3 weeks too late for it to matter, if that train pulls out with him on it." The commotion drew eyes. The women at the ticket window stopped pretending to discuss dry goods. Otto Finn, who had come to see off a shipment of cattle, pushed forward through the crowd with 2 of his sons behind him, and within moments the platform had gone from merely crowded to charged, dozens of townsfolk pressing close, sensing correctly that whatever was about to happen mattered a great deal more than a routine departure. Olive did not wait for Samuel and Purdy to finish their standoff. She went instead straight to Jed Calloway himself, whose face, up close, was not the face of a confident man executing a clean escape, but the gray, hollow face of a man who had not slept properly in weeks. "Jed," she said, low enough that only he and the men flanking him could hear. "I delivered your sister's boy 2 winters ago, out at your father's place on Turkey Creek, Breech Berth. You sat outside the door all night wearing a groove in the porch boards, I remember, because you were certain both of them were going to die and there was nothing you could do about it." She watched something shift behind his eyes at the memory. "I did what I could that night because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone paid me for it. I am asking you now to do the same." Whatever they have paid you, whatever they have threatened you with, is it worth an innocent man's life?" "It ain't that simple," Jed said, his voice cracking. "You don't know what Gideon is, what he'll do to me and mine if I know exactly what he is," Olive said. "I have known what the Coltons are since they tried to string up a man on a forged telegram 2 weeks ago rather than let one honest question be asked. I'm not asking you to protect Samuel Granger out of charity, Jed. I am asking you to save your own soul before you get on that train." Behind her, the standoff between Samuel and Purdy had escalated. Purdy's hand had closed fully around his gun now, and Samuel had gone very still in the particular way of a man who has faced down worse odds than this and knows exactly how much time he has before the situation turns fatal. And Gideon Colton, from atop his gelding, called out cold and clear, "Purdy, whatever it takes, that train leaves with him aboard." It was Otto Fenn, of all people, who tipped the balance, stepping bodily between Purdy and Samuel with his considerable bulk and his 2 grown sons flanking him. "There's near 60 witnesses on this platform, Purdy," Fenn said, mild as milk, though his eyes were hard as flint. "You draw that iron in front of all of them and you will hang regardless of what happens to Granger. Think on it a moment before you do something you cannot undo." Purdy thought on it. His hand did not leave the gun, but it did not draw it either, and in that suspended, breathless moment, Jed Calloway made his choice. "I never seen Granger do nothing," he said, loud enough now that half the platform turned to hear it, his voice shaking but growing steadier with each word, as though the truth, once begun, wanted badly to finish itself. "Gideon come to me the night Tobias Reyes died and told me I was going to sign a paper saying I seen Granger there. And if I didn't, he'd see my whole family run off the county line same as he done the Reyeses. I ain't never even sent that telegram myself. Not truly. Gideon had me copy out the words in Morse the way he wanted them, off his own ranch line, and he told me to say it come from Tucson if anyone ever asked." He held the strongbox out with both trembling hands toward Olive. "It's all in here. The paper he had me copy from, money he paid me. I was fixing to run because I figured wherever I went, it couldn't be worse than staying here and either hanging alongside a lie or getting shot for telling the truth." Gideon Colton's face, up on the black gelding, had gone the color of curdled milk. "That is a lie," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier iron, and the crowd, sensing the shift as surely as cattle sense a coming storm, had already begun to turn against him, murmurs rising into open, angry talk. "Purdy," Gideon snapped, "get that box," but it was too late. Samuel had already crossed the distance and taken the strongbox from Jed's shaking hands, and Otto Fenn's sons had closed ranks around them both, and the crowd, 60 strong and rising, had put itself, almost without any single person deciding to, between Gideon Colton and the evidence that would very likely end his family's grip on the county's court forever. The train came in on schedule, whistles screaming down the valley, and Jed Calloway did not board it. Instead, white-faced but resolute, he let Samuel and Olive walk him back through town toward the sheriff's office, to give his statement properly, this time, before witnesses who would not let it be twisted into anything but what it was. Gideon Colton wheeled his gelding and rode hard out of town, west, toward his father's ranch, and Olive, watching him go with the strongbox heavy and solid in Samuel's arms beside her, felt for the first time in 3 weeks something that was almost, not quite, but almost safety. It did not last the day. Judge Wendell Colton, informed by a rider sent ahead of his son's furious retreat, did not wait for events to overtake him. By the time Olive and Samuel reached the sheriff's office with Jed Calloway and the strongbox, a wire had already gone out over Olive's own line sent, she realized with cold fury when she checked the log later, by the assistant she had trained herself and left in charge of the office that afternoon, a boy named P.D. Marsh who had not understood, or had not cared to understand, what he was helping to accomplish. The wire had gone to the county recorder's office and to a lawyer Colton retained in Tucson, and by evening, Word came back that the judge intended to file an emergency injunction, on the grounds that the new bridge crossed a strip of disputed land his bank claimed under the very same debt papers that had doomed Tobias Ray's, and that all work and use of the crossing must cease immediately pending a hearing. He cannot simply invent a claim on land the day after his son is caught red-handed, Olive said, pacing the small front room of the Telegraph office that evening while Samuel sat with Jed's signed statement spread across the counter, cross-referencing it line by line with the routing marks from the forged telegram. He can invent whatever claim he likes, Samuel said grimly. He owns the bank that holds most of the paper in this county, and until 3 days from now, he is also the only judge in Paloma Crossing willing to rule on anything. It does not matter that his claim will not survive scrutiny once Ashford arrives. It only matters that he can use it to close the bridge, delay the trial, and buy his son time to disappear or worse before anyone can put him under real questioning. Then we do not let him close the bridge, Olive said, the same as we did not let him hang you. But this threat proved harder to answer with courage alone, because the following morning brought with it not another confrontation to be won by nerve and numbers on a crowded platform, but a legal document delivered by the county recorder himself, ordering the bridge closed and a chain and padlock strung across its near approach, with Sheriff Prout, however reluctantly, obligated by his office to enforce it until a higher court said otherwise. And it was that same morning, with the bridge chain shut and Judge Ashford still 2 full days from arriving on his circuit, that word reached Olive at the Telegraph office, carried breathless by Maria Reyes's old aunt on a borrowed mule, that Maria's time had come early and hard, and that something in the berth was already going wrong. The sky that had been so brilliant and blue for 3 straight weeks had, by mid-afternoon, gone the color of a fresh bruise from the western ridgeline clear to the valley floor, and the wind that had merely rattled shutters 10 days before now came down off the mountains with a weight and a violence that made the cottonwoods along the river bend nearly double, their gold leaves stripped away in ragged handfuls and flung across the road like scattered coin. Olive threw her instrument bag and a coil of clean rope into her buggy with hands that had gone perfectly steady now that there was work to be done, the same steadiness her mother had taught her to summon at exactly such moments, when panic would only cost lives that calm might yet save. Samuel was already outside, having heard the aunt's frantic account through the office window, saddling his horse with quick, sure motions. "The bridge is chained," he said. "Colton's toll crossing downstream is the only other way across, and in this wind with the river already rising, I do not like our chances on that old span even if Prout lets us through, which he will not with Colton's order standing." "Then we use our bridge," Olive said, "chain or no chain. That chain is backed by a court order, Olive. Breaking it is exactly the kind of thing Colton would use to have me thrown back in that cell before Ashford ever gets a chance to hear a word of truth. And if we do not break it, Samuel, a woman and a child may both die on the far side of that river tonight, while the man responsible for closing the crossing sits warm in his parlor congratulating himself on a clever piece of paperwork." Olive climbed up into the buggy and looked down at him, and there was no argument left in her face, only resolve. "I am going to that bridge, with the chain or without it. I would very much rather you came with me." He did not argue further. They rode out together through the rising wind, the first hard drops of rain beginning to slant down out of the bruised sky, toward the bridge that stood, pale and new and chained, at the narrows above the darkening, swelling river. Prout was there, as expected, huddled miserably under an oilcloth by the chained gate, and he looked when they arrived less like a man enforcing the law and more like a man deeply unhappy with the position he had been put in. "I got my orders, Samuel," he called over the wind. "I can't just let you. There is a woman dying in childbirth on the other side of this river, Otis," Samuel called back, "and the only other crossing is a toll bridge that has already drowned 2 people in floods half this size. You can arrest me for it after, if Colton insists, but I am not going to stand here and let Olive Easton risk that old bridge in this wind when a good one stands finished 20 feet from where you're keeping guard over a lock and chain?" Prue looked from Samuel's face to Olive's, and then, for a long moment, up at the darkening, churning sky, and something in him, some last reserve of the man he might have been before years of Colton's employ had worn it down, seemed to surface. "I never signed on to be the man who let a mother die over a fence dispute," he said, mostly to himself, and then louder, "I did not see nobody cross this bridge tonight. I was too busy fighting to keep my own hat on in this wind to notice a thing." And he turned his back, deliberately, and busied himself with an entirely unnecessary adjustment to his oilcloth, while Samuel swung down and cut the chain's padlock with a pair of bolt cutters he had, with foresight Olive had not even noticed, brought along in his saddlebag. They crossed together, the buggy wheels loud and hollow on the new planking, the river below already running high and brown and violent, tearing at the pilings with a force that made Olive's stomach clench, even knowing the bridge had been built to withstand exactly this. Lightning cracked somewhere over the ridge, throwing the whole valley into stark white relief for an instant before the darkness closed back in, and by the time they reached the far bank, the rain had become a driving sheet that soaked them both through in moments. The Ray's cabin, when they reached it, was lit by a single guttering lamp, and inside, Maria Ray's lay on a narrow bed slick with sweat, her face gray with pain and exhaustion, while her aunt wrung her hands uselessly in the corner, murmuring prayers in Spanish that Olive answered, without thinking, in the same language, dropping instantly into the rhythm of work her mother had drilled into her since girlhood. "The child is turned wrong," Olive said after her examination, her voice calm even as her heart hammered with the seriousness of it. "Breech, and she has been laboring too long already. I need boiled water, clean linen, and I need you," this to Samuel, who stood in the doorway looking, for the first time since she had known him, entirely out of his depth, "to hold her hands and talk to her steady while I work. Can you do that?" "I can do that," Samuel said, and crossed to the bed, and took Maria's hands in both of his own, and began in a low, even voice to talk to her about nothing in particular, about the bridge, about the mountains, about the child she was about to meet, while outside the storm broke fully over the valley, and Olive Easton worked with steady, sure hands to turn a breeched child and bring it, at last, wailing and furious and entirely, gloriously alive, into a world that had very nearly, in more ways than one, refused to let it be born at all. It was well past midnight when Olive finally came out onto the small covered porch of the Ray's cabin, wrung out and trembling with the aftermath of exertion and fear both, to find Samuel waiting for her, having stepped out to let Maria and her son rest, a lantern between them, the only light against a night that had gone, at last, from violent storm to a softer, steadier rain. "Both of them are well," Olive said. "Tired, and Maria will need rest and good food for a month at least, but well. A boy, she means to name him Tobias for his father." Her voice caught just slightly on the name. "You did that," Samuel said quietly. "Whatever else happens with the trial, whatever Colton manages or does not manage, you crossed a flooded river in a storm to save a woman and child that half this county would have let drown along with their claim, simply because their name was Ray's and not Colton. That is not a small thing, Olive. I do not believe I have ever known anyone braver. You crossed with me," she said. "You cut a lock backed by a judge's order, knowing it might cost you your last chance at a fair trial, because you believed a life mattered more than the law when the law had already been twisted into a weapon." She stepped closer to him on the narrow porch, close enough to feel the warmth of him against the damp chill of the night. "I do not believe I have ever known anyone braver either, Samuel Granger." He reached up and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, the same gesture as the night in the telegraph office, but slower now, more certain, and this time neither of them pulled back. "I love you," he said simply, as though it were the most natural fact in the world, spoken between two exhausted people on a rain-soaked porch at 1 in the morning, with a murder trial 2 days off and a corrupt judge's fury still to be reckoned with. I have loved you, I think, since the moment you climbed onto that wagon with a scrap of yellow paper and told a mob of armed men they were about to kill an innocent man. I do not know how a person is meant to survive loving someone that brave without loving them entirely, and I have stopped trying to survive it any other way. I love you too, Olive said, and there was no hesitation in it at all, only relief, as though she were finally saying aloud a thing her whole body had known for weeks. I think I have loved you since you looked at me from that wagon instead of at the rope, as though I mattered more in that moment than your own life. He kissed her then gently there in the rain-washed dark, and it felt, Olive thought, like the first true quiet either of them had known in 3 exhausting, terrifying weeks, and like the truest kind of promise, made not with words but with the simple, steady fact of 2 people choosing, again and deliberately, to stand together against whatever still remained to be faced. What remained, they both knew even as they held each other on that porch, was considerable. But for the length of that rain-softened hour, it was enough simply to have found each other, whole and alive, on the far side of a river that had nearly cost them both everything. Judge Micah Ashford arrived in Paloma crossing 2 days later than planned, his stage having been delayed by washed-out roads south of Benson in the same storm that had nearly claimed Maria Reyes and her son, and he arrived to find a county in a state of considerable upheaval. He was a lean, gray-whiskered man of perhaps 60, with sharp, tired eyes that had clearly seen every manner of frontier chicanery in his years riding the circuit, and he listened to the full account of events, the forged telegram, the near lynching, the platform confrontation, Jed Calloway's signed confession, the strongbox of evidence, and the emergency injunction closing a bridge built on land Judge Colton had never actually held clear title to. With an expression that grew progressively colder as the recitation went on. The hearing itself, held in the same town hall that had so nearly served as the site of Samuel's execution, was a far quieter affair than the mob scene that had preceded it. Jed Calloway testified, hollow-eyed but steady, describing exactly how Gideon Colton had come to him the night of Tobias Reyes's murder, blood still on his sleeve, and ordered him to sign a false statement and copy out a telegram meant to look as though it had come from a stranger in Tucson. Olive testified about the routing marks and the distinctive sending hand she had recognized, and produced, for the court's examination, both the forged telegram and the original coded draft found in Jed's strongbox, written in Gideon's own hand, with corrections and crossings out that matched, word for word, the final wired lie. Otto Fenn and a dozen others testified to the platform confrontation, and to the pattern of intimidation the Colton family had used for years to keep the county's court and commission bent to their will. Gideon Colton, arrested at his father's ranch the morning after the storm, having tried and failed to flee south toward the border, sat through the hearing in shackles, his earlier arrogance entirely burned away, replaced by a sullen, cornered silence. His father, Judge Wendell Colton, was not arrested that day, but the injunction against the bridge was dissolved within the hour, the land claim revealed under Ashford's questioning to rest on forged bank ledgers that would themselves, Ashford promised, be the subject of a separate territorial investigation. And by the time the circuit judge gavelled the proceedings closed, it was clear to every soul in the town hall that the elder Colton's long reign over Paloma Crossing's court and commerce had come, at last, to its end. Samuel Granger, Judge Ashford said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the silent hall, this court finds no evidence whatsoever to support the charges brought against you, and considerable evidence of a deliberate conspiracy to fabricate such charges for private gain. You are free to go, sir, with this court's apology for the danger you were made to suffer, and its admiration for the restraint and dignity with which you appear to have suffered it. The hall erupted, not into the ugly noise of a mob this time, but into something warmer, applause and shouted congratulations and Otto Fenn's booming laugh rising above it all, and Samuel crossed the floor to where Olive stood, tears standing unashamed in her eyes, and took her hands in both of his, and did not need to say a single word for her to understand exactly what he was feeling. Gideon Colton was bound over for trial on the murder of Tobias Reyes, to be held at the county seat under proper guard this time, far from any influence his father might still attempt to exert, and Judge Wendell Colton, disgraced and facing his own reckoning over the forged bank ledgers, resigned his position within the month and left the valley entirely, his grand house sold within the year to pay off debts that turned out, once properly examined, to be considerably more extensive than anyone had suspected. The valley's true winter came hard on the heels of the trial, an early, heavy snow that closed the high passes for 3 weeks and turned the golden autumn that had hidden its approach so well into a stark, white, silent season. But by the time the snow melted the following spring, the bridge at the Narrows had become something more than a crossing. It had become, in the way such things sometimes did in small frontier towns, a kind of monument, the place where the valley's long, quiet fight against the Colton family's grip on its courts and its commerce had finally been won, and it seemed only natural, to everyone who had watched the two of them fight for it, and for each other in equal measure, that Olive Easton and Samuel Granger should be the ones to stand at its center when they married that April. Beneath cottonwoods just beginning to green again after the hard winter, with Maria Reyes's son Tobias, not yet a year old, gurgling happily in his mother's arms among the gathered witnesses. They built their life together at the foot of that bridge, on a strip of land Otto Fenn and the other ranchers had helped them clear and title properly, this time with no shadow of a forged ledger hanging over it. Samuel put his old lawman's steadiness and his builder's hands to constructing a proper way station there, a low, solid adobe and timber building with a stable out back, and a well that never ran dry, while Olive moved her telegraph key and her instrument bag both into a bright front room that looked out over the river and the span, and before the year was out, the little station at the bridge had become the beating heart of trade and news for that whole reach of the border country. A place where Sonoran traders and Anglo ranchers and travelers along the old Tohono O'odham routes alike stopped to rest their animals, send a wire, or, when the need arose, as it sometimes still did in that hard, beautiful country, to fetch the midwife who lived there with her husband and knew, better than anyone else for 50 miles in any direction, how to bring new life safely into a world that had not always been kind, but that she and Samuel had made, in their own small corner of it, considerably kinder. The bridge itself bore no plaque, no formal name beyond what the county maps eventually recorded, but the people of the valley called it, from that first spring onward, Easton Crossing, and told the story of the telegraph girl and the marshal who had stood together against a corrupt judge, and his son to nearly anyone who asked why a bridge in the middle of cattle country should carry a name at all. Olive would sometimes overhear the tale being told to some traveler resting in the way station's front room, embellished a little more with each telling, the noose grown a little tighter, the storm grown a little wilder, and she would catch Samuel's eye across the room, and he would smile at her in that quiet, certain way he had, and neither of them would correct a single word of it, because the truth at the center of the story, however it grew in the retelling, had never once needed exaggeration. She had read a lie on a telegraph key one autumn night and refused to let it stand. He had trusted her evidence when the whole weight of the county's law had told him it was safer to doubt her. Together they had built a bridge that no forged ledger and no corrupt court could ever again close, and a life, on the far side of every danger they had faced, that neither of them had to build or defend or love alone.